Okay, John Scott. These are all questions about Harleys. I've just treated myself to a WLA, which has only been in my garage for a few days. The carb is full of jelly and corrosion, which I've stripped and cleaned, and it's the same as the carb in your video. I was wondering where you get your rebuild kits from and what I should order.
Right, the first thing is the rubber ducky float. You need to get one of those because if it's the old cork one with varnish on it, the chances of it still being okay are very, very slim.
Yeah.
So you need a rubber ducky float. Any of your 45 part suppliers will do them. 45 service, Jan Boone. You've got a fork, looks like that the needle sits in. That goes up and down, and a pin goes through it here. They quite often wear out in the hole that the pin goes through and the pin itself. So when you invert it and measure your 1/4 of an inch float height, you can measure that, but when it's back up the other way, it can all be wrong.
Yeah.
And the fork there, you need to set it with a 3 to 5 thou clearance, otherwise it jams the needle. And the other thing to buy is get a new needle and seat. They do rubber tip Viton, I think they're called, Viton, and it's like the new petrol, it's impervious to that. So that, I mean, the original ones were just metal anyway, but they do wear out. So new seat, new needle, new float, and the fork and pin if they're worn.
And does that come as a kit, or do you buy?
No, you have to buy them in separate parts normally.
Okay.
Yeah, just separate parts. But any of your main part supplier will do them.
Craig Wilson. I'm currently sorting the rear wheel of my WLA. The current rollers are plus 2 thou. The inner axle must have been ground. I have a 3 thou gap between the rollers and the outer race, so I'm guessing it needs to improve. Looking at the parts suppliers, it appears that this is the largest size roller available. What would you suggest?
As I said, I haven't had a look at what the biggest rollers they do. I thought they went bigger than plus 2. Without looking, I don't know. But basically, if that inner spindle has been ground, I'd just get a new inner spindle and set it all up.
Is plus 3 thou way too much then?
Yeah, it should be right. Yeah. At the end of the day, then they were never a good idea anyway. They didn't ever work properly. You'd always get a little bit of play in them, but yeah, I'd just go for a new spindle and new bearings. Yeah, go from there.
Okay, Tim Wheeler. Referring back to your rear chain adjustment, my chain on a WLA is new. Will it eventually stop stretching? I'm nipping it up every couple of weeks to get rid of the slap on the chain guard.
Shouldn't. I would say something's moving. You shouldn't. I mean, a new chain will stretch, but not that excessively.
How many times would you expect to nip it up?
Once or twice in the first few sort of 500 miles. It shouldn't stretch that much.
Okay.
You got your big nut. You got your spindle goes through. Spacer that side. You got to make sure that spacer is the right way round. The narrow side goes to the wheel.
Okay.
The other side, you've got your big nut. You got your circular thing that the chain adjuster hits on. Then you've got your big nut. Then you've got your special washer. Then you've got your outer nut. And you've got your 2 chain adjusting screws. It's not uncommon for the thread to go on the big nut. That's quite a common fault. I would say a thread's gone somewhere, so I'd strip it all out, take it all apart and have a look at the threads.
Yeah.
But you should know if you're doing it up. I mean, you've got to do that big nut up fairly tightly. But a lot of people leave them loose because the back plates get a bend in them and the back brake jams on and things like that.
Yeah.
The common thing to go again is the 2 chain adjusters that come through. The threads go on them, but if you're locked up really hard, I mean, it will still pull it. Just strip all the bolts out and check all the threads and make sure they're okay. You can go up a size on your chain adjusters, but you have to on the right hand side, looking from the rear, you have to machine a section down on it, otherwise it hits the big nut when you're actually moving the axle.
Yeah.
But I would say if you're having to keep adjust it, there's something wrong. Something's loose somewhere. Yeah.
Okay.
Or it's not loose, but a thread's gone somewhere. You think you're cranking it up hard enough, but it isn't.
So by tightening the chain, you're compensating for something else, which is...
You're tightening the chain, adjusting it all up, it's taking the slack out the chain. The minute you give it any power or revs, boom, it's moving again and the chain's slacking again. I would say something's moving somewhere. They shouldn't have that much play in them.
And this is the section for Ed Pazikas. He's got 3 back-to-back questions here. Question number 1, WLC headlamp shell. Would you be able to show us or give us a hint on how to properly fit the reflector in the shell every time it gets out of place during the mounting? Is there anything one should do in order to avoid misalignments?
We should have a notch in the top of the reflector and a notch in the headlamp. See that hole there? And you've got a bit that sticks out there. That should fit into that. Now this gasket, what they call a washer, they do ones that fit actually round the outside of the lens, or some of them, later ones, have a cork just glued onto there. These clips are very often just missing. On the originals, those clips hold that and that washer. You put that washer around the glass, put the glass into the headlamp rim, put those clips, they're like a W shape, you clip them in and that holds the lens into that. So that should basically just pushes in there. The compression of that gasket, when that is all together, holds that reflector and the glass from moving around. You can put draft excluder tape round here, stick your hand through the thing to hold it in place, snap your ring on, do your screw up. As long as you've got enough there to compress it. It's very unusual you see them with the clips in and the right rubber around the outside. They're normally just bodged in there, or like I say, draft excluder, a bit of cork glued around it. But as long as you've got enough tension there, so when that screw's done up on the bottom of the rim, it's forcing that in that way, it will hold.
So it's almost like packing it out.
Yeah, sort of, yeah.
Number 2, WLC light switch on the left handlebar, the dimmer switch. Could you show the proper connection of the wires?
Basically, they just feed through the switch. So your wires come out the handlebars. You've got 3 wires. The block sort of looks like that, and you've got 3 brass tubes go through it. All you've got to do is strip enough wire back off of these, push them, they only go on one way, you can see which way they go, push them through the brass, so that tube goes all the way through to there, so they're like that. Can't remember which wire, I think it's red and white's the feed wire, I can't remember if it's red and white or red and black. And that your feed wire goes to the centre one, so when your switch pin, which is just like a mushroom head, goes between that and that fires that side, goes between that and that fires that side. So you just strip enough wire back off your main wires, push them through the hole till they come out of this end, smudge them over and get some solder down into them. That's how they were fitted originally. But you need a fairly hot soldering iron. Just your normal 30 amp one isn't going to be enough to heat it up, because you need to get that brass hot enough to get the solder to stick to it.
So what kind of soldering iron would you?
Same thing, just a normal soldering iron, but just get a higher powered one. It just gets hotter, that's all it is.
Any particular, I mean, when you say hotter, I mean...
Well, they do them in, I think they do them in amps. I think it's amps. Well, that says 25 watt. And that I can't read. I don't know where my glasses are, but no, that's 15 watt. So you need one that's a bit more higher power. I'm sure they go up higher than that as well. That one at 25 watts, that works. I've done plenty of them with that.
Okay.
So it's just a matter of getting one that's got a bit more heat coming through it, just enough to heat that little brass ring up.
And lastly, WLC cylinder heads. Is there any particular torque to use in order to tighten them?
You've got to make sure you've got the right washers on them. Aluminium heads, steel heads have different washers.
Yeah.
They're all listed in parts books and blah 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 blah. I torque them down about, normally start at 40 foot-pounds, and you want to go, I can't remember how many head bolts there are, say there's that many, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you know, as long as you're working in diagonals, dink, 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 all the way round.
Yeah.
Start at 40, go up to about 65. I wouldn't go any more than that. Got to make sure you've got the right washers, and you've got to make sure the heads, especially the aluminium ones, are dead flat if you're using the copper head gaskets, the thin head gaskets. If you're using composite gaskets, it's not so important, but just put the heads on a really nice flat surface, thick piece of metal, bit of marble, sandpaper on it, marker pen, engineer's blue if you got it, marker pen, just pick up any high-low spots.
Yeah.
Sand those out. If you're doing the bike out, if you're doing the engine out of the bike, 2 cylinder heads are like that, 2 barrels are like that. Your head stay bolts, there and there, always make sure they're in, fitted and done up tight. 9 times out of 10, if you've got a head blow, you'll find it's around that area because the heads have been done in the bike and they're an absolute pig to get to do up.
Yeah.
A lot easier if you take the petrol tank out of one. Take the petrol tank out if you're doing one with it in the bike.
Yeah.
Oil tank will then slide out with a bit of flex on the pipes.
Yeah.
And you can wedge a bit of bar, bit of wood, just lift the tank up, wedge it underneath because the frame looks like that. Okay, so your cylinder heads are there. You've got a bar that goes there and bolts through there and there and there on the engine. But the oil, if you get this side of the tank out, which is easy, you know, you just got to undo your gear shifter and undo your fuel line and 3 bolts and it will come out. Obviously you've got to take your speedo cover off, but then you can, on top of that tube, if you lift the oil tank up, you can actually wedge a tube under there, and it just gives you a little bit more to get a ratchet in there, or yeah, basically if you're doing it out the bike, not a problem at all. In the bike, you've got to make sure those 2 are done up, and the one at the back here where the down tube comes is an absolute pain in the arse to do as well. But what you want to do is get old school spanners. If you get that style of spanner, yeah, then you've got a chance then of, when that goes down onto your nut, that will clear the fins on the cylinder head.
Okay.
That's why you see them on the front and the back, all the fins are busted off because you can't get in to do them up. So use that, put that on there. If you need to, put a bit of tube on the end of it. You can actually get what they call crow's foot now, or you could put your torque wrench on one of these. It won't give you a true reading, but it will still torque up.
Okay.
Yeah. And like I say, I go to about 65. And if it's still got chuffing, blowing, the only time you'll really notice, obviously, unless it really blows, is when you start it up. You'll get a little dink squeak, and you'll see a little puff of smoke.
Yeah.
On some of the repro barrels, the holes lining up aren't that good. You have to sort of fiddle around with clearing some of the, or clearance fitting some of the holes in the cylinder heads, and then people put goo around them and all that. You shouldn't need it. The main thing on them is make sure those heads are flat. Obviously make sure there's no major defects in the top of the barrels, and torque them down. Yeah, should be fine.
Next week on The Workshop.